so where this starts is that there was a case in the district court uh, where the district court stayed the government's executive orders and Pete Hegseth's directives to ban transgender people from the U.S. military. So a district court stayed that order, stopping the government from firing people on the basis of being transgender. Now, what the Supreme Court did, because I'm sure there was this emergency appeal to the Supreme Court, and that's why the Supreme Court is involved before the case even goes through appeal in the Ninth Circuit, that no, the Supreme Court said we're going to put a stay on the stay of the district court that stopped the government from firing these people. So it wasn't a direct way of saying, no, the government can continue with these firings, but effectively, by staying the district court order stay, they effectively said the government can do whatever it wants right now as the case proceeds in the Ninth Circuit, and if it comes up for certiorari for appeal to the Supreme Court. Now, the case is that the Trump regime, and now I'm reading the excerpt from Stephanie Kennedy's thread, is moving quickly to purge the military of 1,000 service members who have openly identified as transgender. Additionally, the Defense Department is beginning to closely inspect medical records to identify others who have not come forward. Department of Defense officials will scrutinize medical records to determine who has been diagnosed with gender dysphoria, who displays symptoms, and who is being treated. And then it said, troops the government determines to be transgender will be involuntarily forced out of service. Pete Hegseth says, no more trans at the Department of Defense. No more pronouns. No more dudes in dresses. We're done with that shit. And with that, I want to talk to you about the transgender ban. First of all, this is discrimination on the basis of sex, and it violates the Fifth Amendment's equal protection component because it is being done by the state actor, the federal government. And the court has held that there is an equal protection component of the Fifth Amendment that applies to federal government's discrimination on the basis of protected classes, sex being one of them. Now, the nonsense about gender dysphoria. Quick note, personal note, when I was 10, I was diagnosed with gender dysphoria. What gender dysphoria is, according to the NIH, National Institute of Health website, is according to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which is published by the American Psychiatric Association, is defined by a marked incongruence between their experienced or expressed gender and the one they were assigned at birth. It was previously termed gender identity disorder. So it is considered a mental health condition. The Mayo Clinic's overview of gender dysphoria succinctly puts it as saying that gender dysphoria is a feeling of distress that can happen when a person's gender identity differs from the sex assigned at birth. Some transgender and gender diverse people have gender dysphoria at some point in their lives. Other transgender and gender diverse people feel at ease with their bodies and gender identities, and they don't have gender dysphoria. So the diagnosis was created to help people with gender dysphoria get access to health care and treatment that they need. A diagnosis of gender dysphoria focuses on the feeling of distress, and this is key, focuses on the feeling of distress as the issue, not gender identity. So, if somebody identifies as transgender and does not have any records of medical records that says that they have gender dysphoria, then the question remains, will the government do the investigation into whether they have gender dysphoria or not? Whether the feeling of distress is there or not. The feeling of distress in them identifying themselves as man, woman, or a transgender person who identifies as in a different gender than that was assigned to them at birth. Two things here. So if this is a disorder, then it falls under the Americans with Disabilities Act, and the question rises whether firing these people violates the Americans with Disabilities Act. And the second cause of action, that if there are people with gender dysphoria who are being fired because they have at some point been treated or the government diagnoses them with gender dysphoria, then firing them from the military on the basis of a disorder, of a position, of a mental condition that has nothing to do with their performance of duty at work, but rather their own personal identity. If you fire them based on that knowledge, because gender dysphoria focuses on the distress, not the identity that is comfortably formed, then what the government is doing is firing knowing that this particular person has this disability and that's why we are firing this person, but there's no showing that that disability in any way gets in the way of the performance of their duties. And that has to be looked at on a case-by-case basis. But the cause of action that rises from them firing somebody on the basis of a distress that they have for that reason other than their occupation in the military is firing what in tort law you would call an eggshell plaintiff. Meaning, when you fired this person, you knew or you had reason to know that this person was in distress, and that distress didn't have anything to do with their job or the performance of their job. But you took that distress and used that distress knowingly and fired them. So you knew that person was in distress for a reason other than being distressed by the job, and you use that distress as a reason for traumatizing them by firing them, you are essentially creating a tort cause of action on the legal theory of the eggshell plaintiff. Knowingly firing somebody from a position based on knowledge that they are in some way in distress, but that distress not having anything to do with the employment, but rather something completely different, which is what it is in this case, if you were to go with gender dysphoria. And then there is, as I said, the discrimination on the basis of sex, and also the biological assertion that there's just two genders, XX meaning woman and XY meaning man. I'm talking about this genetically, chromosomally. Then there are more than two biological sexes, because there are people with Klinefelter syndrome who have two X's and a Y. And there are people with other combination where they have two Y's and an X. So the idea of sequestering your government on the basis of gender, you are going into an area that is medically protected, and that gives a rise to a cause of action to every single person who is being fired because of gender dysphoria, a cause of action in a tort law for wrongful termination on the basis of eggshell plaintiff. They knowingly fired these people because of a distress they have that has nothing to do with their job. So that is the big major thing that I wanted to talk to you about. And the discrimination that the message, I believe, that the message that the Supreme Court put out is that we are not going to get in the way of the government doing what it is doing to a class of people who we have not recognized as being a protected class. But history would show that both in America and all over the world, the third sex, or the notion of somebody not conforming to their gender, have been a marginalized group of people who have been historically discriminated against. So in the course of ordered liberty, it falls on the Supreme Court to assert that this is a protected class of people who must at least be given rational basis scrutiny in determining whether their rights are being arbitrarily or capriciously denied. So there has to be at least a legitimate basis for the government to say that this action is justified. There has to be a legitimate state interest that would override the liberty interest of transgender people to seek employment in the military. And where would you find that? Where would you find that legitimate interest? Because there's no study, there's no literature that says that transgender people are in any way inadequate as service members. So the question here is complicated. I hope I helped uncomplicate it a little bit more. But this is discrimination on various levels. And this is the disruption of the military's morale, because you are discriminating in the military, going into people's records and disrupting the regular process of how the military works, getting in the way of the military's readiness. That's what you are doing when you are disrupting the military and discriminating against a protected class that historically has been marginalized against.